Welcome back to Man Sanity. I'm Dustin. I'm here with Zach.
How you doing?
Also, hey, you're back in, man.
I'm back here. This is Chase,
Chase.
by the way. Yeah.
And then Jordan, who does not have his typical episode.
No, I gotta quit that, man.
However, he has some really good questions though, right? So, hey, we are here with Stan Friedman. He is a physicist, and he also is probably the most known UFO expert. And, we have some questions for you, Stan. What kind of got you into kind of learning about UFOs and ufology and kind of going down that road?
Well, it's because I'm a cheapskate, really. Way back when I was 24 years old, I was working as a young nuclear physicist with General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department just outside Cincinnati, Ohio. And I was ordering books from a mail-order bookstore, and I needed one more book so I wouldn't have to pay shipping. And there was the report on unidentified flying objects by Air Force Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, who had been head of Project Blue Book in the early 50s.
Okay.
And it looked like it might be interesting. I didn't have any particular knowledge of nor interest in UFOs. I'd read a lot of science fiction when I was young, but it was a hardcover book, $2.95, marked down to $1, so it wasn't going to cost me anything because shipping would have been $1. So I got the book, and I was excited by working in industry. The nuclear airplane program at GE was a pretty good-sized program for back then. In 1958, we spent $100 million. We employed 3,500 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. So, it wasn't 6 professors and 20 grad students, to say the least.
Absolutely.
And one of my concerns was that, if these things are real, and I didn't have an opinion because I didn't know anything. I know you're supposed to have opinions no matter whether you know anything or not.
But that's okay. At least you want to know the truth.
Well, that's what I want to know is the truth. But I thought that, look, if these things were real and they were using nuclear power, it would help our program. And secondly, I was a strong proponent of the Air Force. They were co-sponsors of the program. The Atomic Energy Commission and the Air Force sponsored the General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department program. And, if worse came to worse, it'd be worth a laugh. It wasn't costing me anything, buck.
Yeah, you can't lose on $1.
Yeah, so I read the book.
Unless you're in Vegas.
It didn't convince me, but it turns out, in retrospect, it was a good first book to read because there's a lot of garbage out there. And I shared it with a neighbor. Charlie was 10 years older than I was, an engineer. And he was more impressed than I was, and that impressed me because he was a pretty sharp guy. And 10 years later, when I gave a talk to his electrical engineering group, we each had moved away. And the first thing he and his wife said was, "We knew you when you didn't believe in flying saucers," which was nice to hear. Well, that got me interested. And I moved to California, had a good librarian. I read another 10 books, some of which were garbage. If I'd read them first, I would never have read another one. And then I had an epiphany, if you will. I found at the University of California, Berkeley Library a copy of Project Blue Book, Special Report number 14.
Now, is the Project Blue Book, is that similar to the government program Project Blue Beam? Or does that have anything to do with it?
No, it has nothing to do with Blue Beam. Blue Book was the Air Force group concerned with UFOs from about 1952 to 1969, headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And I was at the University of California, Berkeley Library, and here's something that I was surprised to find, because it hadn't been mentioned in any of the books that I had read. And it was a huge compilation. It had over 240 charts, tables, graphs, and maps of data. The work had been done by, I found out later, didn't say in the report itself, by the Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio, very well-respected research and development firm. And they looked at 3,201 cases, and they did quality evaluations. They did cross-comparison between the unknowns and the knowns. It was a tremendous amount of data. I'm a data hound, so I was really overjoyed. But what really bugged me was the guy who put this together included the Air Force press release from October 1955 when the study was completed. And I was totally shocked. I mean, I was working under security, so I'm accustomed to sometimes you have to tiptoe around the truth, if you will, because you can't break security.
Sure.
But in this case, looking at the data, it turned out, here's what the Secretary of the Air Force said. On the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those popularly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available. Now, the only trouble with that is I had the data in front of me, all those charts and tables and stuff. The unknowns were 21.5%. That's not a round off of 3.
That's a lie.
It's a lie, a flat-out lie. In addition, there was a separate group called insufficient information. If there wasn't enough data available about a case, the 4 scientists who gave final statements about, what it was, identification, could list it as anything else, unless all 4 of them agreed it was an unknown. So 9.3% insufficient information, 21.5% unknowns, and they said even the unknown 3%. Now that made me angry. I don't like being lied to, especially by the Secretary of the Air Force, no less.
And what year was this again?
This would have been about 1961.
Oh, okay.
Long time ago. And so I decided I wanted to get to the bottom of this. I joined APRO and NICAP, the 2 major groups back then, and really dug into things. I wanted to get their newsletters and so forth. But it was finding that report that really shook me up, partly because the press release didn't say who did the work or where the work was done and didn't even give the title of the report. Surely if a newsman had heard special report number 14, he would have said, hey, what happened to 1 through 13? But didn't do that. So it was recognition on my part that we're dealing with liars here. Now, that's not the only lie I've seen about UFOs. There have been lots of them, but that one got me stirred up. And I didn't give my first lecture until 1967 in Pittsburgh. And that came about sort of, well, I won't say reluctantly, but unexpectedly. I had read Frank Edwards' book, Flying Saucers, Serious Business, when I was I was an itinerant nuclear physicist. 3 years here, 3 years there, 3 years someplace else. They kept canceling programs on me,
Well, that's not good.
And, that I didn't realize, but that was norm for that business, advanced nuclear and space stuff. Anyway, I worked for General Motors in Indianapolis and got to know Frank Edwards, who was based there. He was a newsman. He knew everybody. And when I moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Frank had given me a copy of his book, and I read the book, and I contacted him. I said, Frank, you know everybody. Give me some names. I want to go public. So he gave me a bunch of names. One of them was the producer for a radio show, would you believe, called Contact. Great name.
Was it like an alien? Was it an alien kind of talk show, or is it just a regular?
It was a regular show, and the Contact had nothing to do with UFOs or aliens or anything like that. But it was, KDKA was the biggest station in town, one of the oldest 50,000-watt clear channel stations.
Oh, okay.
So I called the producer, and his response was, don't call us, we'll call you. I thought, gee, being a nuclear physicist for Westinghouse in Pittsburgh, big Westinghouse town, would get me on real easy. But
he's not like us. We beg people to come on.
Well, the kicker was, don't call us, we'll call you. But less than a month later, he called me at 6:30 to be on a 7 o'clock show because somebody had canceled at the last minute. And I've often wondered how many people did they call before they got somebody who could go on. I didn't live that far from the station. Anyway, I did the show. Somebody at work at Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab on the nuclear rocket program told me, Stan, our book review club is reading Frank's book. Why don't you give a lecture to our group? So I did. My first lecture was in her living room. And I did that show again, and I did more lectures. And then, again, coincidence. One of 2 days that I drove to work from downtown Pittsburgh, the astronuclear lab was out of town, with a woman who was a supervisor at Westinghouse. And I was saying, gee, I'd like to speak at Carnegie Mellon University. And she says, well, why don't you talk to the dean? And I said, well, I talked to Dr. So-and-so, and he wasn't interested. She said, Stan, the dean's my husband. He's heard you on the radio. Why don't you give him a call? Okay. So I called him. We arranged for me to give a lecture a few weeks later, but it was during the day, so I knew I'd have to take some time off work. And his final question was, how much do you want? And I thought, well, I'm going to have to take some time off work. How about $100? I figured he'd knock me down to 50, but he bought me for 100.
Right.
And then he told me, because I knew his wife, what he was paying the other speakers in the series. $1,500, $1,700,
Holy
$1,600.
Jeez.
Anyway, the talk went extremely well. He sent a letter to the agent through whom he had booked me, and they booked me at a very important talk for me, the Engineering Society of Detroit. Now, that's a bunch of hard-nosed engineers, And I got $300 plus expenses, so we're getting up in the world.
Heck yeah.
And money.
We had 1,008 people for dinner and a talk, and there were no negative questions.
You had 8,000 people, you said?
1,008.
Oh, wow.
1008. And